To retreat means to leave your positions under attack. In the game, it means to move out of the hex that has been attacked in a combat. Retreat reduces the losses a defender suffers in a combat. By retreating, the defender's losses are reduced by 1/3. In most cases, the 1/3 is found by rounding to the nearest whole number. For example, 4 reduced by 1/3 is 3, while 11 reduced by 1/3 is 7. Retreating will also reduce the defender's ability to inflict losses on the attacker by counterattacking. Retreating is not always voluntary. In many cases, and I'll get into this later, the defender must retreat. In any case, if a defender is going to retreat, he must declare this prior to counterattacking. This is because retreating units are not tripled for the counterattack. Instead, they are only doubled. Now let's look at a simple example that you see on the screen. Let's say that the Germans attack this Russian unit in hex 2606, the 7th Siberian Division, with the 20 strength points that they have adjacent to it. And let's say the attack die roll calls for the defender to lose 3 strength points. The Russian player declares that the 7th Siberian Division will retreat. This will reduce the losses by 1/3. So instead of losing 3 strength points, the Russian unit will lose only 2. In the counterattack, rather than tripling the defender's strength and using the 15 column on the combat results table, the Russian player will only double the unit strength to 10 as this unit is going to retreat. Let's take a look at what this will then look like. The Russian unit takes his losses and retreats. And then, just to finish out the example, let's say the results of the counterattack are a 1 strength point loss on the attacker that the German player elects to take out of the Landwehr Brigade. So here now you can see both sides have taken losses, and the retreating defender has moved out of the hex and away from the enemy. The defender has options when retreating, but he must retreat according to the priorities outlined in the rules. In general, he retreats to get out of enemy zones of control and retreats closer to a friendly headquarters. This is because, in retreating, units are trying to get away from the enemy and will generally retreat back towards their supply source. Different retreating units from the same hex may retreat to different hexes of the same retreat priority. To see this, let's look at a variation of the previous example. In this case, the Russians have 2 divisions in hex 2606. As before, let's say the German attack inflicts a 3 strength point loss on the Russians. The Russian player declares that he will retreat, reducing his losses by 1/3 from 3 to 2. He takes the losses as shown, but since both hexes 2706 and 2707 are both out of an enemy zone of control, and both are the same distance from the Russian headquarters, the Russian player can move 1 unit into 2706 and the other into 2707. Retreating units remain in an enemy zone of control only when there are no other higher priority options. In this example, the Russian player attacks a German unit in hex 1612. Let's say that the attack result is a 3 and the German declares that he will retreat. Both hexes 1611 and 1712 are in enemy zones of control, but they're occupied by other German units. In this case, the German unit would retreat to hex 1712, as it has no options to retreat outside of enemy zones of control, and hex 1712 happens to be closer to the German headquarters than hex 1611. Let's take a look at the result. This shows the result of the retreat and the German losses. Also, I wanted to show you that the Russians would probably take 2 strength points in losses as a result of the German counterattacking at strength 10 due to doubling rather than tripling, plus the Germans would have had woods as defensive terrain and would have had a +2 die roll modifier for their counterattack. As I alluded to earlier, often the defender is forced to retreat. Soldiers are rarely suicidal, and most will abandon their positions when they feel they are in extreme danger. In the Tannenberg introductory game, the German player is forced to retreat if the result of the attack would cause him to lose more than half of the strength defending in a hex. The Russian player is forced to retreat if an attack would cause him to lose more than a third of the strength defending in a hex. Whether forced or not, retreat has the same result. The defender reduces his losses by a third, and his counterattack is weakened. This means that in the example of the Germans attacking into hex 2606, that even a result of 2 would force this Russian unit to retreat, as this would be more than a third of the strength defending in the hex. After the defender retreats, attacking units have the option of moving into the vacated hex. This is called advance after combat. The attacker gets to choose which of his units advance into the vacated hex, but no unit can move into the hex until all other units that lost a greater percentage of their strength in the combat are advanced first. This reflects the fact that units pushing the furthest forward in an attack are going to take the highest losses. Let's go back to the first example of retreat to show advance after combat. The Germans have attacked and caused the Russians to retreat from hex 2606. So the German attackers could advance into this hex. The unit that must advance first is the 6th Landwehr Brigade, as it is the only unit involved in the combat that took losses. Note also that in taking a 1 strength point loss, the brigade lost half of its strength, going from 2 to 1. This would mean it would advance into a vacated hex before, say, a 5-5 reduced to a 3-5 in an attack, because that unit would have lost less than half, and the unit that lost the greater portion of its strength in the attack advances first. After it advances, let's move the 6th Landwehr into the vacated hex, the German player could choose to send any other units involved in the attack into 2606 as well. So we could send this guy and this guy, or you could just send the 6th Landwehr Brigade, or you could just keep everyone where they were and choose not to advance at all. In this example, the Russians attacked and forced the Germans to retreat from hex 1612. They retreated back to 1712, as you remember. And the Russian attackers took 2 strength points of losses, 1 strength point each from the 6th and 8th divisions. The Russians can now advance into hex 1612, but the 6th and 8th divisions would advance first, and both would have to advance into hex 1612 before any additional units could. This means that, because of how the Russian player decided to take his losses, the Russians could not advance either of the units from hex 1613 into hex 1612 without both the 6th and 8th divisions moving into that hex first. This shows you that you need to be wise in how you take your losses. In this case, it may not have been best to have taken losses with the 8th division, and instead maybe the Russian player should have put a -1 marker on one of the divisions in hex 1613 instead. This would have provided better options for advance after combat for him.